He's watching you.
Who?
Frank Carlo had faced death 1,000 times without flinching. But now, with Mabel trembling beside him in the darkness of his penthouse office, his hands shook. "He's watching you," she whispered, her voice barely audible against the hum of the city below. He looked up slowly, dark eyes narrowing as they found hers. The question formed on his lips, "Who?" but it wasn't really a question. It was a test of her knowledge, her access, her loyalty. She'd crossed a line by being here, by knowing, by warning him. She reached out and touched the cold steel of his desk, a gesture so tender it contradicted everything about who they were. "Your hands are shaking," she whispered. He pressed his forehead to the desk, voice breaking in a way no one had ever heard. "You're the first thing that could destroy me." She smiled through the fear. "Good. Let me help you survive this." And the man who'd never surrendered to anyone, who'd built an empire on control and violence, surrendered completely to the need to protect her. But 3 weeks earlier, she was just a waitress, he noticed. And he was the dangerous stranger at table 7. Welcome back, my amazing family and friends. If you're tuned in and excited for today's story, make sure to hit that subscribe button and drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from, because tomorrow, I've got another fascinating story coming your way that you definitely won't want to miss. Now, let's get back to the story. Evening light filtered through the tall windows of Rosso's like liquid gold, illuminating the marble tables and casting long shadows across the wine-dark walls. The scent of aged garlic, rosemary, and expensive perfume mingled with the soft clink of crystal glasses. Soft jazz played beneath the whisper of dangerous conversations, men who controlled the city conducting business over imported wine and hand-rolled cigars. Mabel Davis moved between the tables with practiced grace, her black vest and white shirt immaculate despite the chaos of service. Every movement was calculated precision, a perfectly angled pour, a knowing glance, a smile that was professional but never false. This was her sanctuary in a different way, not a place she'd built, but a place where she'd mastered the art of survival without surrender. She'd worked at Rosso's for 3 years, long enough to recognize the men who came here, long enough to know which ones were truly dangerous. She never acknowledged their power. She acknowledged only their thirst. The door opened. A man entered alone, moving through the restaurant like a predator entering territory. He wore a charcoal gray suit that cost more than her monthly rent. Dark hair fell slightly across eyes that cut through the room like steel. Gold chains glinted against his chest, tasteful but unmistakable. He carried himself with the kind of authority that made other powerful men nod in deference. Mabel knew exactly who he was. She watched, professionally detached, as he was escorted to table 7, the corner table, the one with a view of every entrance and exit. The table reserved for men conducting business that didn't exist on paper. He ordered without looking at the menu. Barolo. 1990, and leave the bottle. Mabel delivered it personally, setting the wine with the care it demanded. When she looked at him, she found him watching her with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. Most men looked through waitresses. He looked at her. "You're new," he said. It wasn't a question. "I've worked here 3 years," she replied, her voice steady. She held his gaze without fear or deference. "You're new to noticing." Something flickered across his face, surprise, maybe amusement. The shadow of a smile. She turned to leave, but his voice stopped her. "What's your name?" "Mabel," she said, not turning back. "And I don't offer anything beyond service." The corner of his mouth curved upward. "Neither do I." That night, after her shift ended and she was counting tips in the restaurant's back office, Mabel realized her hands were still trembling. Not from fear. From something far more dangerous. The man at table 7 had already become unforgettable. And 3 weeks from that moment, she would slip a note into his hand that would change everything. But tonight, she didn't know that yet. Tonight, she only knew that when she returned to take his glass, still full, untouched, he was reading a newspaper or pretending to. His eyes, however, never left her. Not for a single moment. His gaze tracked her movements across the restaurant like a hunter observing prey. Except Mabel had never been prey. And neither had he. Both were about to discover what happened when two people equally matched in intelligence and strength collided in a space where surrender was impossible, until it became inevitable. The 7 p.m. service at Rosso's moved like clockwork. Mabel had perfected the rhythm 3 years ago: table turns, wine pours, the subtle art of invisibility paired with impeccable presence. She moved between patrons with the grace of someone who understood that power wasn't claimed, it was earned through flawless execution. A regular businessman fumbled with his napkin. She anticipated his need and replaced it before he asked. An elderly couple debated wine selections. She suggested the 1990 Barolo without pushing, letting them believe the choice was theirs. This was her mastery, the quiet control of making men feel in command while she orchestrated everything beneath the surface. The door opened at 7:15 p.m. Frank Carlo entered like weather changing. The restaurant didn't simply acknowledge his presence, it reorganized around it. Conversation softened. The maitre d' straightened immediately, gesturing toward table 7 with almost reverent deference. This was a man accustomed to corridors parting before him, to fear arriving seconds before his footsteps. Mabel observed from the bar as he settled into the corner table, that dangerous vantage point overlooking every entrance. His tailored charcoal suit caught the amber light. Tattoos visible at his wrist, remnants of a life written on skin. His eyes scanned the restaurant with the precision of someone cataloging threats and assets. When their gazes crossed, she didn't look away. Most women, most people, would have. Most understood instinctively that men like this expected deference, that meeting their intensity was provocation. Mabel understood something different, that men like this respected only those who didn't flinch. She approached his table, notepad steady in her hand. "Good evening. What can I pour for you?" He studied her for a long moment, as if recalibrating some internal assessment. "Barolo. 1990, and leave the bottle." She nodded, made no comment about his preference, and turned to leave. "Wait." His voice was quiet but carried absolute authority. "What's your name?" "Mabel," she said, meeting his eyes directly. "And I don't offer anything beyond excellent service." The faintest smile curved his mouth, dangerous and genuine. "Neither do I," he replied. As she walked away, she felt the weight of his gaze follow her. Not predatory. Intrigued. For the first time in years, Mabel realized her hands were trembling as she poured his wine. She had no idea that this moment would define everything that came after. Frank Carlo returned to Rosso's the following evening. He didn't make a reservation, didn't need one. The maitre d' simply nodded and escorted him to table 7 without a word. But this time, before settling, Frank scanned the restaurant. His eyes found her immediately, Mabel, moving through the dining room with that same infuriating grace, that same absolute composure. "I'll take her section," he said quietly to the maitre d'. It wasn't a request. When Mabel approached his table, there was the briefest flicker of recognition in her eyes. She didn't comment on his return, didn't offer the false warmth most servers deployed with regulars. She simply said, "Welcome back. The same as last night?" "Surprise me," he said. She almost smiled. "Almost. That's not how restaurants work, Mr. Carlo," he offered. "And you're right. I'll take the same Barolo." Over the next 2 weeks, he came every evening at precisely 7:15 p.m. Always table 7. Always requesting her section. Always ordering the same wine but asking different questions between courses. On the 8th visit, as she delivered his espresso, he asked, "Do you ever leave this place?" Mabel set the cup down with practiced precision. "Weekends, occasionally." "Why?" "You move through this restaurant like it's the only world you know." "It's the only world I need to know," she replied, meeting his gaze. The rest is noise. He leaned back, studying her with an intensity that would have made most people uncomfortable. Mabel remained perfectly still. Most people fear me, he said quietly. It wasn't arrogance. It was observation. Most people fear a lot of things, she countered. Doesn't make those things worthy of the fear. Something shifted in his expression, a crack in the facade of controlled menace. For a moment, he looked almost vulnerable, almost human beneath the tailored suits and dangerous reputation. You should fear me, Mabel. She held his gaze steadily. Why? Will you hurt me? No, he said, and the word carried absolute certainty. But wanting to protect you means I'll have to hurt everyone else. She said nothing, but she didn't look away either. In that silence, something fundamental changed between them. He'd revealed something true, not his words, but the reality beneath them. And she'd met it without flinching. As she turned to leave, he spoke again. What's your real dream, Mabel? Not this restaurant. What do you actually want? She paused, surprising herself with honesty. To be seen as more than what I do. When she walked away, she felt him watching her again. But this time, she understood the difference between being observed as prey and being truly seen. Frank Carlo had just crossed that line. The rhythm became ritualized. Every evening at 7 p.m., Frank arrived like clockwork. Table 7. Mabel's section. Always. She learned to read him in the silence between moments. When he entered with shoulders slightly tensed, she knew the afternoon had brought difficult business. She'd bring his wine first, the Barolo breathing at precisely the right temperature, understanding that he needed control before conversation. When his jaw was loose, his gaze softer, she knew he'd won whatever battle had occupied his day. Then she'd allow herself to linger slightly longer, to let their exchanges drift into genuine territory. 3 weeks of this choreography, and Mabel understood Frank Carlo better than he understood himself. She learned that he took his espresso dark, no sugar, at 8:47 p.m. exactly. She learned that he always sat with his back to the corner, watching the entrance, not paranoia, she realized, but habit so deeply ingrained it had become instinct. She learned that on Thursdays he was quieter, more introspective, though he never explained why. She learned that when he smiled, truly smiled, not the dangerous curve of his lips, it transformed his entire face into something almost boyish. More importantly, Frank began to tell her things. I didn't choose this life, he said one evening, his voice low enough that only she could hear. It chose me. Everyone has a choice, Mabel replied, refilling his water glass. Not everyone. Some of us are born into cages we didn't build. He paused. I've spent 20 years making sure no one else can lock me in another one. She set the glass down gently. That's not freedom, Frank. That's just a different kind of prison. He looked at her then, really looked at her, and something in his chest cracked open. How did you become so wise? I learned to listen, she said simply. Most people don't actually speak. They perform. You're different. I'm dangerous, he said, as if reminding both of them. Yes, Mabel agreed without hesitation. And you're also lonely. Those things don't have to define each other. The confession hung between them like smoke. Night after night, he returned. And night after night, she was there, not waiting for him, but present in a way that felt intentional. He told her about the weight of decisions that affected hundreds of lives. About the loneliness of power. About the first time he'd hurt someone and how the violence had never stopped feeling necessary and wrong simultaneously. She never judged. Never flinched. Never offered easy comfort or false reassurance. One evening, as she delivered his espresso, Frank reached out and briefly touched her wrist. It was the first time he'd touched her, a gesture so tentative it contradicted everything about who he was. Thank you, he said quietly. For what? For letting me be human when I'm here. Mabel understood then that this was no longer a customer and waitress. This was two people meeting across an impossible divide and choosing connection anyway. The quiet bond had become something neither of them could deny. The evening arrived ordinary until it didn't. Mabel was approaching Frank's table with his espresso when the door opened. A man entered, broad-shouldered, scarred, with the particular kind of menace that came from absolute certainty in violence. He wasn't alone. Two others flanked him, positioned like wolves assessing territory. They didn't sit. They stood near the bar, ordering nothing, simply watching. Specifically, watching Frank. Mabel set the espresso down and felt Frank's entire body shift beneath the surface. His breathing remained steady, his posture unchanged, but something lethal awakened behind his eyes. She'd never seen him like this, coiled, waiting, calculating. Then the scarred man's gaze found her. It was a look she recognized immediately. Not desire. Assessment. She was being measured, catalogued, evaluated for usefulness. His eyes lingered on her face, traced the line of her neck, took in her uniform, her proximity to Frank. She watched the moment understanding settled across his features. The slight nod to his companions. The predatory smile. She was being marked. Mabel maintained her composure, refilled water glasses 2 tables over, moved through the restaurant with practiced normalcy. But something fundamental had shifted. The air felt thinner. Danger had entered the room and taken a seat in her peripheral vision. When the men finally left 30 minutes later, the scarred man caught her eye one more time. A promise. A threat. She didn't look away, but her hands trembled as she cleared plates. Frank remained until 9 p.m., an hour longer than usual, and when he finally stood to leave, he didn't speak to her. Couldn't. The presence of those men had transformed him back into something purely dangerous, purely functional. He simply left a stack of bills on the table and walked out without a glance. That night, alone in her apartment, Mabel did something she'd avoided for 3 years, she searched. Frank Carlo. Mafia Boss. Empire spanning 3 counties. The name led to photographs, articles, whispered news stories. And then, deeper in the search results, she found it, a family tree of the Castellano organization. Her finger traced the connections until she found the scarred man's name. Marco Castellano. Rival faction. Territory disputes. Violence that had claimed lives. She searched further, her heart accelerating. And there it was, a forum discussion from 2 weeks ago. A single sentence that made her blood freeze. Carlo's been spending time at Rosso's. There's a waitress. Could be useful. Mabel sat in the darkness of her apartment, phone glowing in her hands, understanding crystallizing with terrible clarity. She wasn't just a waitress to Frank anymore. She was a liability. A target. A weakness that had been identified and documented. She was leverage. The question wasn't whether they knew about her. They did. The question was what they would do with that knowledge. And more terrifyingly, what Frank would do to protect her when they made their move. Mabel didn't sleep. She lay in her apartment's darkness, phone beside her pillow, Frank's phone number memorized but never called. The knowledge sat in her chest like a stone, heavy, sharp-edged, impossible to ignore. She'd spent 3 years perfecting the art of invisibility, of moving through the world without making waves, of existing in the gray space between involvement and safety. That space no longer existed. By 4 a.m., she understood the architecture of her dilemma. If she told Frank, she became entangled in his world irreversibly. She'd move from observer to participant, from peripheral to central. The Castellanos would know she'd warned him. That knowledge alone would make her a threat. A woman who could be silenced. A loose end requiring management. But silence was complicity. Knowing what she knew and saying nothing meant she was choosing Frank's blindness over his survival. It meant accepting that people she'd served wine to, people she'd smiled at, would use her as bait. It meant allowing the connection they'd built, that fragile, genuine thing, to be weaponized without resistance. It meant becoming someone she despised. Mabel rose as dawn broke over the city. She showered, dressed in her Rosso's uniform with deliberate care, and drove to the restaurant. She moved through her shift mechanically, serving other tables, avoiding the moment when Frank would arrive. At 6:45 p.m., she texted him, "Don't come tonight. I need to talk. Somewhere private." The response came within seconds. "Where?" "The rooftop. After close." She didn't know if he'd come. Didn't know if he'd understand the urgency encoded in her brevity. But when the restaurant finally emptied and the staff dispersed, Frank was already there, waiting in the shadows of the rooftop access stairs like he'd never left, like he'd been anticipating this conversation before she'd even learned it was necessary. "You're afraid," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes. Because of last night." "Because I know what they're planning," Mabel said, her voice steady despite the terror threading through her veins. "And because telling you this means I'm choosing a side. There's no going back from that choice, Frank." He stepped closer, and she saw the weight he carried, the burden of every decision that affected lives beyond his own. "You already chose a side the night you served me tea instead of fear. This is different." "No," he said quietly. "This is just the moment where you stop pretending it isn't." Mabel understood then that her moral code had never actually offered her a choice. It had only ever offered her this, the courage to stand in danger beside someone worth standing for. She'd known it since the moment she'd touched the scar on his desk and called him human. "They're planning to use me," she said, the words crystallizing her commitment. "To leverage you. I don't know when or how, but they're watching." Frank's expression didn't change, but something ancient and lethal awakened behind his eyes. "Then we stop them first." And Mabel realized that by warning him, she hadn't just saved his life. She'd irrevocably entered his. Friday night at Rosso's moved with controlled chaos. The restaurant was at full capacity, every table occupied, every server navigating the delicate dance of service at the intersection of wealth and power. The air hummed with expensive conversation and the clink of crystal. Frank arrived at 7:15 p.m. exactly, as if the previous night's rooftop confession had changed nothing about his routine. Mabel watched him settle into table 7, his posture relaxed, his demeanor composed. To anyone observing, he was simply a regular patron enjoying his evening. No one could see the lethal awareness coiled beneath his tailored suit, the calculation happening behind those dark eyes. Marco Castellano sat 3 tables away. He'd been there since 7:02 p.m., nursing a single glass of wine, his attention split between his phone and Frank. 2 associates occupied nearby tables, positioned strategically, watchers, documenting every interaction, every movement. Mabel felt their presence like weight, like eyes tracking her across the dining room. She'd rehearsed this moment obsessively since the rooftop conversation. Every step choreographed. Every detail precise. One mistake, a trembling hand, a lingering glance, a moment too long, and everything would unravel. At 8:15 p.m., she approached Frank's table with his wine. The Barolo was perfect, breathing at precisely the right temperature, the color deep as blood in the ambient light. She held the bottle in her left hand, her right hand steady as she reached for his glass. As she began to pour, her left hand, obscured by the bottle's body from the watcher's view, released the note. The small folded paper fell from her fingers directly into Frank's open palm. The motion was seamless, invisible, a single gesture absorbed into the larger choreography of service. A woman pouring wine. Nothing more. "Your wine, Mr. Carlo," she said, her voice carrying professional warmth devoid of subtext. Frank's fingers closed around the note as she finished pouring. She set the bottle in the stand with practiced precision, withdrew slightly, and allowed her eyes to meet his for exactly 1 second, the amount of time a waitress might spend acknowledging a regular patron's nod. In that second, she saw him unfold the note beneath the table's edge. Saw his eyes track across the words, "He's watching you. We need to talk." Rooftop. Midnight. His jaw tightened. A muscle worked in his cheek. Then, slowly, deliberately, he looked up at her. His expression was unreadable, the face of a man accustomed to hiding everything. But his eyes held something she recognized: acknowledgement. Commitment. The acceptance of whatever consequence this small act of rebellion would bring. He folded the note carefully, placed it inside his jacket pocket, and nodded once. The gesture was almost imperceptible. But it contained everything: his understanding, his agreement, his promise that he would be there. Mabel turned and walked away, her heart hammering against her ribs so violently she was certain everyone in the restaurant could hear it. Behind her, she felt the weight of Marco Castellano's attention, the tension of those watchers recalibrating, processing what they'd just witnessed. They'd seen nothing, of course. But something in the air had shifted. Danger had drawn its breath. The rooftop was a cathedral of city lights. Mabel arrived first, emerging through the access door into the November night. Wind caught her hair, lifted it from her shoulders. Below, the city sprawled in 1,000 points of illumination, headlights, neon signs, the gold-lit windows of 1,000 lives continuing their ordinary trajectories. None of them knew what was happening 30 stories above them. Frank appeared within minutes, his silhouette emerging from the darkness like something coalescing from shadow. He didn't speak immediately. He simply stood beside her, both of them looking out at the glittering expanse. "They're planning to take you in 3 days, Mabel said, her voice steady despite the cold. "Marco will have you isolated during a business meeting. They'll use me as leverage, threaten to hurt me unless you surrender your territories. Everything you've built." Frank turned toward her. "How do you know this?" "The forum posts. Conversations I overheard. Marco watching me like I'm a target marked for collection." She looked at him then. "I became a problem the moment he realized you cared whether I lived or died." Understanding crystallized across his face. "You've made yourself a liability by telling me this." "I've made myself a liability by existing," Mabel said quietly. "But yes. By warning you, I've ensured they know I'm choosing sides." Frank reached out and pulled her close, his hand finding the back of her neck with surprising tenderness. "I won't let them touch you." The promise hung between them, fierce and absolute. He kissed her then, not a gentle kiss, but one that tasted of gratitude and desperation and the knowledge that everything was about to change. The gunshot shattered the moment. Marco Castellano emerged from the stairwell, weapon raised, his expression twisted with predatory satisfaction. He wasn't alone. 2 more men flanked him, cutting off the only exit. The trap had been set before Mabel even delivered the note. They'd followed. They'd waited. "Step away from her, Carlo," Marco said, his voice carrying the confidence of a man holding all the cards. Frank moved with terrifying speed. He pivoted in front of Mabel, shielding her body with his own. The next shot came, and Frank lunged forward, not away, but toward Marco with the grace of a predator in its element. The gun went off again, the sound deafening in the open air, but Frank was already there, moving with lethal efficiency. What happened next was pure violence. Economical, brutal, executed with the precision of someone who'd spent 2 decades perfecting the art of elimination. Marco's weapon fell. One of the associates tried to run, Frank caught him before he reached the stairs. The other simply stood frozen, understanding that his last moments had arrived. It was over in seconds. Frank stood breathing heavily, blood on his shirt that wasn't his expression transformed into something ancient and dangerous. Then he looked back at Mabel, and everything shifted. The lethal warrior receded. Behind it stood a man terrified of what she'd just witnessed. "I'm sorry," he said. Mabel stepped forward and took his hand, the one still bloodied from violence, still warm with adrenaline. "You chose me," she said simply. "That's all that matters." In that moment, with bodies at their feet and the city indifferent below them, she understood that Frank Carlo had just destroyed everything to protect her. And she'd never feel safer in anyone's hands. They didn't leave the rooftop immediately. Frank stood motionless for long minutes, staring at his bloodied hands as though they belonged to a stranger. Mabel remained beside him, her hand never releasing his, anchoring him to something human in the aftermath of violence. Below them, the city continued its indifferent pulse, the world unchanged, oblivious to the fact that three men no longer existed in it. "I need to tell you something," Frank said finally, his voice raw. "And I need you to understand that every word is true." She waited. "I was going to die in this world. Not today, maybe not tomorrow, but inevitably. It's the only ending men like me receive." He turned to face her, and she saw the exhaustion written across his features, not physical, but spiritual. "But then you served me tea and refused to fear me. And everything changed." Frank walked to the edge of the rooftop, gripping the railing. "My empire is poison, Mabel. Every territory I control, every person in my organization, every dollar in my accounts, it's all built on blood I can't wash away. I've spent 20 years becoming the most dangerous man in this city, and it's all been for nothing. Because tonight, I realize that all of it, means less to me than your safety." "Frank. Let me finish," he said quietly. "I'm giving you a choice. Real choice. Not the illusion I've offered other people." He turned back to her, and his eyes held the weight of genuine surrender. "Option 1, we disappear. Tonight. I have resources, safe houses, passports. We leave this city, this life, everything. We become ghosts. We survive." He paused, letting that option settle between them. "Option 2, I step away from the underworld entirely. I transition my empire to trusted lieutenants. I become legitimate. But I stay in this city. With you. At Rosso's, watching you work. Building something real instead of something violent." Mabel understood then that he was offering her the only thing he truly had, the choice between his old world or no world at all. It was generous. It was terrifying. It was everything. "There's a third option," she said quietly. Frank's expression shifted. "There isn't." "Yes, there is." Mabel stepped closer, taking his face in her hands. "You do both. You change, genuinely, completely, and you stay. You don't disappear. You transform. You take everything you've learned about power and strategy and protection, and you redirect it. You become the man I've already seen you are, just without the violence. You're asking me to be something I'm not." "No," Mabel said. "I'm asking you to be something you already are. You've been becoming it every night you sat at table 7 and talked to me instead of conducting business. Every moment you chose connection over control." Frank pulled her close, and she felt him trembling. "What if I fail? What if I can't change?" "Then we fail together," she said simply. "But you won't fail. Not because you're strong enough, but because you're choosing something worth changing for." He held her against his chest, and Mabel realized that the man who'd entered her life as a dangerous stranger was now simply a man choosing redemption. Not running from his past, but building a future that made it matter less. "I'll do it," Frank whispered. "I'll become the man you deserve." Mabel smiled against his chest. "You already are. You're just finally seeing it too." 6 months had the texture of redemption. The house sat on the edge of the city where urban sprawl surrendered to green, a modernist structure of glass and steel that somehow managed to feel like a sanctuary rather than a fortress. Frank had chosen it deliberately: clean lines, open spaces, rooms flooded with natural light. A place built for living rather than conducting business in shadows. Mabel moved through the kitchen with the ease of someone who'd come to belong there. Morning light caught the diamond on her left hand, a simple band she'd insisted on, nothing ostentatious. Frank had proposed on a Tuesday, over coffee, in a manner so understated that Mabel almost missed it. "Will you build this life with me? Not romantic theater. Just truth." She was consulting now for a collective of high-end restaurants, helping them cultivate the kind of grace and dignity she'd perfected at Rosso's. The work suited her, influence without the weight of direct service, teaching other servers how to read people, how to anticipate need, how to maintain composure under pressure. She'd discovered that her greatest gift wasn't serving others, it was teaching others to serve with integrity. Frank had transformed his empire methodically. The transition to his lieutenants had taken 3 months of careful orchestration, not a power struggle, but a deliberate passing of the torch to men he trusted with his legacy. He'd kept enough to maintain influence, enough to ensure the underworld understood he was stepping back by choice, not weakness. Then he'd walked away entirely. Now he owned a logistics company. Legitimate. Profitable. Boring by the standards of his former life, but he moved through his days with a lightness that suggested boredom was precisely what he'd been starving for. His hands, once instruments of violence, now signed contracts and shook hands and held her with a gentleness that still caught her off guard. The pregnancy had been unplanned but perfectly timed, a reminder that their future was no longer theoretical. It was cellular, undeniable, arriving in the form of a small life growing inside her. They stood on the balcony as sunset bled across the sky in shades of amber and rose. The city glittered below them, beautiful and distant. Frank stood behind Mabel, his hand resting on her belly, feeling the subtle movements of their child. His face held the wonder of a man encountering something sacred. "I never thought I could be the man you deserved," he whispered, his voice carrying all the weight of everything he'd survived to reach this moment. Mabel turned her head slightly, meeting his eyes. "You chose to be. That's all that matters." He kissed the top of her head, and she felt him exhale, a release of tension held for decades. The man who'd once controlled everything through fear had learned to surrender to something far more powerful, the choice to become better. Below them, the city continued its endless motion. But here, on this balcony, with the sunset painting everything in shades of grace, Frank and Mabel existed in the stillness they'd built together. Not despite his past, but because they'd both chosen to make it mean something. Love, she realized, wasn't the absence of danger. It was the courage to face danger and choose transformation anyway. The baby moved again, and Frank's hand tightened gently against her belly, a silent promise to this new life that the world they were creating would be different. Better. Real. For the first time in 20 years, Frank Carlo believed in tomorrow. What a journey of transformation. This story proves that love is the courage to choose change. If this narrative resonated with you, please like and share this video with someone who needs to hear it, and join our community by hitting subscribe. We'll see you in the next story.